The 2025 US National Security Strategy beckons major implications for the Caribbean. It is a directional signal, a map of where US power, attention, and pressure will fall over the next several years. We often treat US strategy as something meant for Europe, the Middle East, or East Asia. This document is different. It clearly recenters the Western Hemisphere as a core strategic space, with direct consequences for small states, maritime corridors, energy routes, migration flows, and political alignment. What I will try to do here is explain what the strategy is actually saying, especially in its opening principles and its Americas section. I'll also try to draw concrete lessons and suggestions for Caribbean governments, particularly Trinidad and Tobago, which now exists on a fault line we do not control but cannot escape. The first strategic mistake the Caribbean could make is to misread what this document is. This is not a symbolic or purely rhetorical paper. It is a prioritization directive as we move to a new multipolar world.
How many poles will there be in the multipolar world? Already now, 4 main ones can be identified: the collective West, Russia, India, and China, 4 state civilizations, plus the growing split within the West itself, which is increasingly dividing into 2 poles.
The strategy argues that the United States spent too long trying to manage the entire world at once, which diluted its power. The new posture is clear: do fewer things in fewer places and enforce them more aggressively. It means more pressure in the regions Washington still considers vital, and the Caribbean is inside that circle. The strategy breaks with the idea that the US must lead everywhere. Instead, it focuses on core national interests with measurable security returns. Once a region is classified as core, ambiguity disappears.
We will also deny adversaries' ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities in our hemisphere. Past administrations perpetuated the belief that the Monroe Doctrine had expired. They were wrong. The Monroe Doctrine is in effect, and it is stronger than ever under the Trump corollary. A common sense restoration of our power and prerogatives in this hemisphere, consistent with U.S. interests.
The Western Hemisphere is treated as home space, not a distant theater. Caribbean states are security adjacent stakeholders, with a clear place in American security strategy as it relates to stability, maritime routes, and infrastructure. Security in the document is reframed around movement and control. Migration, trafficking, and transnational flows are now primary national security threats, tied directly to organized crime, terrorism, and foreign interference. In this logic, routes matter more than origins. States become strategically significant if they sit on maritime corridors, air transit routes, and informal movement pathways. We must define our role in migration and transit control now, in law, policy, and diplomacy. Waiting for a crisis means having responsibilities assigned to us from the outside. The strategy fuses economics and security in what we call geoeconomic. Trade access, tariffs, supply chains, ports, telecoms, and infrastructure finance are treated as security instruments, not neutral development choices. For small states, this is a structural change. Decision about who builds a port, who finances a telecom network, or who runs logistics software becomes strategic decisions, whether governments call them that or not. The Caribbean must create at least a basic national security review process for strategic infrastructure. If we do not treat these decisions as strategic, someone else will. Finally, the strategy returns to geographic competition. Control of physical, maritime, and infrastructure space. The Western Hemisphere is declared non-neutral. This sets up the revival of Monroe Doctrine logic later in the document, but the message is already clear. Location outweighs size. The Caribbean must abandon the assumption that smallness equals invisibility. Strategic innocence or foolish ideas of neutrality is now a liability. The US is signaling that it will act in fewer regions more forcefully using all tools, military, economic, legal, and diplomatic, and it expects clear alignment from partners in core regions for the Caribbean. The era of quiet ambiguity is done. The Americas section is a statement of control. The United States identifies the Western Hemisphere as a core security space where developments are no longer treated as neutral or purely domestic. For the Caribbean, this is the warning bell. The strategy openly commits to reasserting and enforcing the Monroe Doctrine updated for modern threats. This is operational, not nostalgic. Washington is signaling that non-hemispheric powers should not establish military presence, gain intelligence footholds, control strategic infrastructure, or dominate critical assets anywhere in the Americas, large or small states alike. The Caribbean must clarify in advance which sectors are non-negotiable from a security standpoint, whether that's ports, telecoms, energy, or surveillance, and communicate this consistently to all partners, not just the US. The first operational verb is enlist. The US expects partners to actively help secure the hemisphere, not cooperate only when convenient. That includes, of course, migration control, counter narcotics and organized crime, maritime interdiction, and intelligence and data sharing. The strategy leans heavily on Coast Guard deployments, flexible naval presence, and joint operations. The Caribbean must treat Coast Guards and navies as frontline diplomatic actors, not just technical agencies. The Caribbean needs clear mandates, legal backing, and political support for the partnerships they are being drawn into. The second verb, expand, means expanding US influence and partnership while shrinking space for rivals such as China, Russia, and India, even when their footprint is economic or developmental. For the Caribbean, external influence often arrives through infrastructure finance, telecommunications, port and energy deals, and development projects. The strategy says that effects matter more than labels. A development project that creates strategic leverage will be treated as a security issue. We must adopt cabinet level criteria or red lines for external deals, so economic ministries do not accidentally trigger strategic crises through purely commercial decisions. The strategy is obsessed with the sea lanes, transit corridors, choke points, port access, and interdiction capability. For Washington, control of movement is key. Territory is less important than who can move, what, where, and how quickly. In this logic, the Caribbean is not peripheral, it is connective tissue linking North and South America and the Atlantic to the Panama Canal. The Caribbean must invest in maritime domain awareness and regional cooperation. Share data, common procedures, and legal frameworks so that we can exercise sovereignty at sea rather than having decisions made over our heads. The Caribbean here is no longer treated as a quiet buffer. It is active strategic space. More tension and engagement are coming with less room for ambiguity. Strategy only matters when it collides with geography, limited capacity, and real crises. Here's how this document lands in Caribbean reality. Infrastructure is no longer passive. Ports, airports, LNG terminals, telecommunications, telecoms, data centers, and logistics hubs are now security assets. Projects taken for development reasons years ago can suddenly become diplomatic flashpoints, security concerns, leverage for larger powers. The Caribbean needs to build a strategic infrastructure register, mapping who owns, finances, maintains, and controls key assets. We cannot defend or renegotiate what we have not first mapped. A maritime-centric strategy. Coast Guards and navies become the primary interface between Caribbean states and US security policy. We can expect more joint patrols, shared information, and pressure to act quickly during crises, all with small fleets, tight fuel budgets, and limited personnel. The Caribbean must ensure that any cooperation framework includes asset support, maintenance and training, clear rules of engagement and jurisdiction. Otherwise, operational cooperation can slip into operational dependence. Even if a Caribbean country is not a major source of migration, it can be caught in the transit web. States must find themselves responsible for interdictions, temporary holding, documentation checks and returns, without adequate law facilities or resources. The Caribbean, we must prepare migration contingency plans now. We need to clarify legal responsibilities, develop emergency protocols, and coordinate regionally on returns, processing, and humanitarian standards. Improvising in a crisis is risky for both people and states. Trade, finance, and investment are increasingly tools of security policy. Market access and financing, and even insurance, can be tied to perceptions of alignment and reliability. This pressure will often land first in economic ministries, not foreign or defense ministries. As such, we must integrate economic, security, and foreign policy planning. Siloed decisions on trade or investment can unintentionally undermine strategic positioning. The Caribbean, we sit next to multiple potential flashpoints. Venezuela right now, energy routes, migration surges, and external military signaling. In crises, priorities shift to speed, access, and coordination. Diplomatic niceties, they shrink. The Caribbean must develop crisis access playbooks in advance. What cooperation looks like in this new environment, what red lines exist, who authorizes what. This is so that decisions are guided by policy rather than panic. The bottom line is this: the strategy means more attention, more engagement, and more expectations on the Caribbean. The risk is not involvement, but unplanned, reactive involvement. The 2025 strategy does not erase Caribbean agency. The 2025 strategy raises an important question. How do we respond intelligently and collectively? In this environment, early clarity is a form of power. States that delay have roles defined for them. Publicly and privately, we need to articulate what cooperation can we realistically offer? What capacities do we have? What legal and political constraints do we face? Silence will be read as consent or a vacuum to be filled. Coast Guards and navies are no longer just enforcement bodies, they are instruments of foreign policy. Here's an option. Bring maritime leaders into strategic and diplomatic conversations, not just technical meetings. A professional force without political backing becomes a tool for others. No single Caribbean state can balance or negotiate effectively alone. Fragmentation increases vulnerability. Here's another option. Use CARICOM and sub-regional mechanisms to harmonize standards for ports and infrastructure, align procurement rules, share maritime and migration intelligence, and define common red lines. Collective clarity reduces individual pressure. Alignment with US security concerns does not require abandoning all other partners. It requires strategic selectivity. We need to continue diversifying partners, but treat critical sectors, i.e. the ports, the telecoms, energy, data, as requiring extra scrutiny and stronger safeguards for sovereignty. Strategic transitions create leverage for us. We can use US urgency to negotiate for long-term maritime capacity building, integrated disaster and climate security support, energy transition and resilience funding, legal and technical training for security institutions, and of course, infrastructure development. Cooperation should leave stronger institutions, not just operational footprints. Here's the final message. The 2025 US National Security Strategy tells us one thing clearly. The Caribbean is no longer peripheral. It is strategically adjacent. The reality brings risk, but also leverage. The danger is not engagement, but unplanned engagement. Our task now is to move from being managed space to being strategic partner space before others decide that for us.